Chapter 1. Cultural Christianity. The great irony of this chapter is that it addresses the same concerns that many Christians themselves are troubled by about Western Christianity, specifically in America. This concern is that many Americans assume that Christianity is a heritage and not a belief, like being Jewish culturally, but not in religious devotion. Thus we find people saying that they are Christian because they were raised in church, regardless of whether they believe in the Orthodox creeds or anything distinctively Christian or not, or that they believe all manner of New Age, pantheistic, and what has been called therapeutic, moralistic, deistic belief. So one wonders at the onset of this chapter how a problem with one specific cultural expression of Christianity, which is criticized by even Christians themselves, can even hope to serve as a refutation of historic Orthodox Christianity as a whole. Nevertheless, while McAfee and I agree that there is a problem, we disagree on what kind of problem. For McAfee, the problem is not that people are being disingenuous in their beliefs about the Christian religion by claiming the Christian title as a cultural moniker rather than as a sign of repentance and faith, but rather that this is a problem of Christianity. That is, that Christianity organically breeds what he calls a kind of genetic belief. He writes, "Religion can be something similar to genetic inheritance." Page 2. But what he seems to assume is that this kind of cultural Christianity is what the Christian religion is, when in fact it is simply a cultural heritage of a religious tradition and quite distinct from the religious beliefs and practices themselves. So if we accept McAfee's critique of this religious inheritance, then we would still be left wondering, so what? That has very little to do with whether or not religious belief in general, or Christianity in particular, are true or false. It is hard then to see how this critique could serve as any function in any genuine attempt to disprove Christianity at large. However, McAfee will try to use this concept later in the chapter to argue that raising children in the church necessarily eliminates their freedom to explore other worldviews. Here one must wonder what his argument would then be for raising children in any worldview. He does not say. We can legitimately address how we raise our children to be critical thinkers, but if we believe that our worldview is correct, why should we teach them in order to cause them to disbelieve in it? From my personal acknowledgment of McAfee, I can confidently say that he is a philosophical naturalist, and while he may teach his children to be critical thinkers, will he actually teach them all that the theistic, deistic, pantheistic, polytheistic, or even distinctly existentialistic and nihilistic worldviews are equally viable options when compared to his naturalistic worldview? Will he intentionally not educate them within a naturalistic framework? One can only wonder. Yet my skepticism will not allow me to think that he would be as approving of his children reading Augustine and Aquinas over Dawkins and Bennett. McAfee alludes, though probably unintentionally, to the distinction Christians have always made between sheep and goats on page 1. Here I found myself wondering if he knows that this is actually one of the major arguments Christians use in explaining the crimes of the church done in the name of God. That is, that those who commit such atrocities are most likely not Christians, since they so clearly betray their own rejection of the fundamental ethics of living as a citizen in the kingdom of God, and do not therefore represent Christianity at all. Yet here he himself accepts that even positively affirms the claims that there are significant numbers of vapid Christians in name only who do not believe the Christian teaching and who fail to act very Christian-like. Will he then allow it as a vapid response, or at least part of a response, from Christians later on concerning the crimes of Christians? We will see. He then coins the term genetics of religion, a somewhat problematic term, I think. While this term might be somewhat descriptive of the way any belief is passed from parents to children, he will actually use this as a basis for the fallacy by the same name, the genetic fallacy. It is his contention that this chapter, that because many people grow up to be Christians due only to the faith of their parents, and possess little to no real understanding about the nature, content, or reliability of their own professed faith, that this is a rationale for the rejection of Christianity as a religion. For him, this is an argument against Christianity. He points to Christians who unreflectively grow up in a Christian home on page 3, though I would argue that anyone who is a Christian in belief and practice, and not just by heritage, generally has thought quite deeply about their beliefs. Yet he seems to ignore that this same argument can be applied to any home of any worldview. It is so general that this argument actually becomes vacuous. What does he think about converts raised in a skeptical home, but who come to believe in God later in life, like myself? Would this not, by his own standard, prove Christianity to be true, since he seems to think conversion from a worldview is a sign of open-mindedness? Or does he only presuppose this to be true when he comes to disbelieve in religion rather than coming to repudiate naturalism? A case of flat-out question-begging, if there ever was one. However, beyond this, the genetic fallacy is to evaluate the truth of a belief by pointing to how or why a person came to believe something. The reason this is a fallacy should be clear. The truth or falsity of a belief is determined regardless of how one comes to hold the belief. A person in the Middle Ages might have come to believe fervently that the earth was a sphere orbiting a flaming ball of gas through hallucination, a dream, or through innocent believing the testimony of a person who says that they were able to flap their wings and fly to the moon and see for themselves that it was so. Now, does this mean that the content of the belief, that the earth is a sphere that circles a flaming ball of gas, is false and disreputable simply because of how the person came to hold that belief? Not at all. This is the problem with the genetic fallacy. It plays on our ability to see irrationality in the means by which someone came to hold a belief, and then tries to smuggle disbelief into the discourse on the truth value of the belief itself. It is a kind of bait and switch. It tries to distract you with your disregard for how this poor person came to believe in something, while it slips the content of the belief through the side door. Thus, even if all the Christians in the world are guilty of this kind of cultural Christianity, it would have no bearing on our evaluation of the truth or falsity of Christianity. He then goes on to say that inheriting religion is as likely as inheriting hair or eye color, page 4. While this is obviously hyperbole, the link is so drastically overstated, even when taken as hyperbole, as to be nothing but sheer nonsense. If McAfee believes, which as an atheist I would be safe betting that he does, that genetics are determinative of all human functions, even belief itself, as popularly argued by men such as Daniel Dennett, Jerry Coyne, and Sam Harris, then what recourse does he have to distinguish between Christianity and atheism in this respect? If beliefs about God, here belief and disbelief must be equally included, are conditioned by upbringing, then that scalpel would seem to cut both ways, and it would discredit atheism right along with theism. It either proves too little or far too much because it is not commentary on the validity of Christianity or any belief, but on the model of parents as teachers. It is a critique of pedagogy rather than of theology. McAfee also asserts that all Americans are responsible to not simply take what they are taught from family at face value, as opposed to studying, questioning, and learning about multiple religious traditions in order to make an informed decision, page 4. And further on says that when a child is raised in religion, it eliminates the choice in what is arguably the most important decision one can make in a lifetime. Page 4. However, this provokes several questions. Firstly, at what point does McAfee believe children are cognitively capable of doing this? Does he not know that worldview development begins far before a child is capable of doing any of those reflective cognitive functions? And while I agree with some of his comments, with the exception that religion instruction necessarily eliminates choice, I would wonder if he would encourage children raised in atheistic homes to do the same, to consider various religions as equally viable options. From what I can tell, I do not know that he would, especially considering the entire propagandistic book he published for children called The Belief Book, which so entirely misrepresents religious belief, specifically Christian belief, that I can barely refrain from calling it an intentional deceptive for children. In spite of that, we must also wonder that what are parents supposed to teach their children? What is missing in this discussion, besides that the logical extension of this commonly taken is nothing but an extreme invasion of privacy and parental rights, something on par with an Orwellian 1984 or a Huxleyan Brave New World, is that McAfee and many of the new atheists seem to think that a parent not teaching their children a Christian worldview is religiously neutral, or even worldview neutral, when in fact to teach a child rational, moral, spiritual, and existential autonomy is not neutral by any means, and is in effect the plain presupposition of naturalism. Worldview neutrality is a myth. This does not mean a child should be discouraged from questioning, investigating, studying, etc., as listed above, but that the Christian message is precisely that we are not rationally, morally, spiritually, or existentially autonomous agents, but are rather created imago Dei, in the image of God, and thus derive logic, reason, morality, existence, natural law, and even our ability to question, seek answers, and comprehend an intelligent universe from the fact that we are creatures created by God, and all possess what John Calvin called the sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine. If this, then, is the case, we can ask, based on the second quote, whether or not children raised in McAfee's, Dawkins, or Dennett's home are equally as a loss of choice. Surely none of them would wait to teach their children anything until they had the cognitive abilities to scrutinize and think critically about what their parents believe. Indeed, without parents giving them a presuppositional worldview framework to begin with, they would be at a total loss for even how to think critically about anything in the first place. This may be an assumption, but I would venture to guess that Dennett did not tuck his young daughter at night and encourage her to explore the truth of the world's major religions for herself as equally probable worldviews, and to critically evaluate his own worldview as well. Even if, as loving fathers, they likely would be supportive of whatever their child later comes to believe, I highly doubt that things such as this would be encouraged or taught as a valid option. It is kind of free thought with an eye to one direction. McAfee also makes the claim that those children raised in Christian homes will only ever end up believing that their religion is the right one because of their freedom of choice has been stifled. They are like worldview PWOs in the mind. What I find so ironic about this is that most people who are cultural Christians, by heritage only, the group of Christians that McAfee is addressing in this chapter, are actually more often than not quite liberal in their theology, if they even have a theology at all. They are the Judeo-Christian version of the New Age movement. All you can really need is love, pluralistic. All roads lead to God, or capitalistic. Have it your way away. God is wanting you happy and nice. In fact, this kind of cultural religious believer is often the type of person who is not willing to let their religious tradition inform their own autonomous beliefs, moral code, and public actions, precisely because of their total lack of religious conviction. and their New Age pluralism, in addition to an almost compulsive need to not offend anyone. Either that, or they are so far to the other extreme of indoctrination that they do not even represent mainline or Orthodox Christianity, and their bigotry would seem to place them in the goats camp. To say that these are the ones who, because of their childhood environment, will be hateful, ignorant, or justify violence is exactly to attach the action of the extreme right of the spectrum to all other Christians. The cultural Christians can come from the far left liberal side of the spectrum or from the radical extremist fundamentalism on the far right. Measuring this gradation seems to be beyond McAfee's ability to willingness to do, and so it is no wonder that he not only misses what he aims at the extremes on the left and the right, but also on the orthodox moderate middle.